Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Hey, everybody, and welcome back for another episode of the Church and Culture Podcast. In a lot of ways, I feel like the past few years have been years of redefining womanhood and manhood and whether there's anything in between. We've touched a bit on women's roles within the church. That was on a previous episode, which we can link to in the show notes, as well as the recent trad wives movement. We've also talked about toxic masculinity and the need to go to the Bible when determining what truly defines a man. Something we haven't tackled head on, though, which I think is a worthwhile topic, is that of modern fatherhood. With more mothers pursuing careers outside of the home, traditional motherhood and fatherhood roles are, I would say, being rethought. Many mothers are no longer with their children for a disproportionately longer amount of time than fathers, and so a lot of parenting responsibilities are, for many, shifting. So, Jim, could we start off this conversation by maybe you telling us more about what makes the context of a 2024 father unique?
Barbie. Barbie dominated the summer movie scene, becoming not only the highest grossing film of the year, but highest grossing film I think Warner Brothers has ever released. And I think it was already, last time I checked, 14th highest grossing film of all time. Barbie was not just a fun movie. It raised a lot of questions about our topic today, what it means to be a woman, and maybe even more, what it means to be a man, ironically. Ken, the character, if you've seen it, goes from living in a matriarchal world to then wanting to create a patriarchal world. But then the Barbies get back in control, but work for more equality for the Kens. And so it kind of goes back and forth. If you've seen the movie, it can be a little hard to explain, but it makes sense. Barbie was not creating those questions of identity and place for men. It was mirroring them in our culture. Right now, there seems to be a lot of confusion about just what it means to be a man, more maybe now than ever. The Kens of the world do not know what it means to be a Ken. And if you start, in fact, typing, just in Google, what does it mean to be, and let it auto-complete, you'll find things like what it means to be an American, what it means to be a leader, what it means to be a friend. You won't find what it means to be a woman, but you'll find right at the very top what it means to be a man. That's where the confusion is. There was an article a few months ago in the Washington Post that was simply titled "Men Are Lost." And let me just read you part of that article. It was really interesting. It got a lot of attention. It's in writing about the men who were interviewed, it was found that they struggled to relate to women. They didn't have enough friends. They lacked long-term goals. Some just quietly disappeared, subsumed into video games and porn, or sucked into the alt-right and the web of misogynistic communities known as the manosphere. The weirdness manifested in the national political scene, too, in the 4chan-fueled 2016 campaign, in the backlash to Me Too, and amateur militias during the Black Lives Matter protests. Misogynistic text thread chatter took a physical form in the Proud Boys, some of whom attacked the Capitol on January 6th. Young men everywhere were trying on new identities, many of them ugly, all gesturing toward a desire to belong. And this is how it concludes. It felt like a widespread identity crisis, as if they didn't know how to be. And we talked about that in an earlier podcast on toxic masculinity, which we can link in the show notes. But I bring it up again here because it's a framework, it's a background for what we're going to be talking about. There was one doctoral student who was interviewed by an undergrad student who simply said, who asked, what does good masculinity look like? And the older student said, to be honest with you, I didn't have an answer for him. I don't know. And so what you see, to keep answering this question, because I think it's an important thing to tease out, you have growing numbers of young adult men, working age men, who have detached from the labor market, particularly those between the ages of 25 and 34. Men now receive about 74 bachelor's degrees for every 100 awarded to women. Men account for more than 70% of the decline in overall college attendance right now. As women have become less dependent on marriage for their own lives and livelihoods and financial security, or even less dependent on men for motherhood, quite frankly, they're becoming increasingly selective. which has led to a rise in lonely single young men. In fact, more men live with their parents right now than they do any type of romantic partner. Men account for almost 3 out of every 4 deaths of despair, which is stunning to think about, meaning deaths resulting from suicide or substance abuse. I mean, it's 75% of those are men. Men are just reeling right now, I think, across the cultural board. And the questions are huge. What does it mean to be a man in our world? What does being a man look like? Where do you fit in? And then if you find an answer, how do you know it's the right one? Because there's a lot of answers out there, to fill that gap. Is it the hyper masculine, which we talked about specifically in that podcast, the hyper misogynistic type of view of making it all about sports and women and cigars and sex? Is it chivalry, almost switching to the complete other side, which is confusing for men as well because they don't know where chivalry needs to end and feminism begin, and respect for that? Do you throw masculinity away entirely? Just act like that doesn't exist? Do you go with what has been called the 3 Bs, of what it means to be a man? The first is your billfold, meaning how financially successful that you are, how much money you make, the title you have. The second B stands for the ball field, just how strong you are, how athletic you are, how sports oriented you are. And the final B is the bedroom, how popular you are with women. The 3 Bs are very shallow, very superficial, not a lot to work with. And then you throw in, and here we're turning to our topic, the fact that men don't have fathers to look to for all things masculinity, much less fatherhood themselves. Since 1960, the percentage of boys living apart from their biological fathers has nearly doubled, from like 17% to 32%. And there was an analysis by a Brookings Institute scholar that I found really interesting. He said that if you grow up in a single parent household and you go to a typical public school and access a typical medical system, there is a decent chance that you will not encounter a male figure of authority until middle school or later. Not your doctor, not your teachers, no one around you. And what is that going to feel like to a young boy? It's going to feel like you're very, very lost.
I remember listening to, kind of bringing it back to fatherhood specifically. I was listening to a podcast a few years ago that it was co-hosted by 3 dads. They were in their probably 20s or 30s, and they wanted to re-envision dad life. They were talking about how dads were often portrayed, at least in the media, as clueless and uninvolved, often absent. I mean, I just think about TV dads like Homer Simpson or Al Bundy, Peter Griffin, Rob Foreman, Phil Dunphy. Even the absence of dads in so many classic Disney films, like Cinderella, Frozen, even Lion King. I remember coming across an article and it was just titled, "What does Disney have against dads?" Because they're either dead or just completely absent, or just not there. And then even when dads are present, they're just not often taken seriously. They're often portrayed as, consistently making messes that the moms have to, clean up while rolling their eyes. And so the co-host of this podcast wanted to recast a vision of fatherhood in which dads are seen, and truly because they are thoughtful and involved and very present in their children's lives and in parenting in general. Would you agree with their assessment of the way that dads are often portrayed culturally? And if so, where do you think that comes from?
Well, I think I can give a fairly short answer on this one. I would totally agree.
Hmm.
Throwing dads, stepmoms get a bad rap too.
Yeah.
Stepmoms and dads in Disney, but yes, I would agree. And I think the bar for media dads is admittedly very, very, very low. They're often bad. They're absent. They're abusive. They're bumbling buffoons. I mean, Peppa Pig's father is the butt of every joke. Homer Simpson is a clown, and on it goes. So, yeah, I think it's a spot on observation.
I also came across an article recently in the Atlantic that pointed out that there's an entire culture, let's call it dad culture, clad with dad jokes, dad bods, dad rock, and so on. But that dad culture actually has nothing to do with parenting. Like, you don't have to be a dad to tell a dad joke or to have a dad bod. Mom jokes, on the other hand, or mom genes, they are directly tied to the act of raising children or the results of pregnancy and labor on a woman's body. So, with all that said, what would you hope to be more characteristic of a modern dad culture?
Okay. I want to bring up something here, and I want to talk about it because I think right now it's becoming a touchstone for cultural conversation about fatherhood. It's becoming a benchmark for fatherhood. It's just becoming a quite significant discussion point. And yes, I'm talking about Bluey. Let's do it. And specifically the dad on the show Bandit. And I really like this show. I've watched several episodes with my grandkids, and and let's talk about Bandit, who is the dad on Bluey. It's an Emmy Award-winning children's cartoon from Australia. If people are not familiar with it, it's taken the world by storm. Bandit has really helped define, interestingly, fatherhood for many, and continues to actually inspire thousands of real-life dads around the world. Bandit and his wife Chili are caring. They're wonderful, but also imperfect parents. Every episode only lasts 7 minutes, and it focuses on playtime and imagination while portraying these, flawed, complex characters. This is not just a show for kids. If you have watched it, and it's kind of like the way Sesame Street was at its best, where there'd be like something going for the adults and the kids at the same time. The kids aren't going to get it, but the parents will, and that's always usually the best children's TV. But it's brought real life parents together in a way that I think few shows have. In fact, Bandit has fathers really reassessing their own parenting, I think, in some healthy ways. Joe Brum, who's the creator of Bluey, once said in an interview that Bluey was based on his own experiences of parenting. He didn't set out to create the Healers, that's the last name of the family, as the perfect family. He just wanted the show to show what it's really like when you're raising your kids, real life, what it's like to get dragged into their crazy games and go with it. Brum, who largely is a work from home dad, so it's a bit autobiographical, is heavily involved in his two daughters' playtime. And Bandit, in a very similar vein, is shown as the primary caregiver of Bluey and her little sister, his little sister, Bingo, her little sister, Bingo. He is an archaeologist, and he's which means in the show, a dog who digs bones. In the show, though, he always stops what he's doing to engage with his kids. So, it's a yeah.
Yeah. Now, I might be biased here with my next question, so let me know if I'm being unfair, but I often wonder if maybe it is even challenging for some present day dads to want to accept a new vision of fatherhood in which they are more present and more involved. I mean, the age-old image of a father coming home from work to find dinner on the table and obedient children waiting for him, gently patting them on the head before sending them to bed. Like that doesn't sound to many dads, I'm guessing, half bad. And most millennial dads had a stay at home mom and a less than present dad. So I would just assume that it might be harder to get behind a vision of fatherhood that potentially involves helping with homework, if not even homeschooling, changing diapers, giving baths, packing lunches, taking kids to practices, appointments, activities, grocery shopping. I mean, on it goes. Do you sense any of that resistance?
More maybe from women than men.
Okay, keep
Uh,
talking.
there was a great discussion on this in a recent Breakpoint commentary that we'll put in the notes. But let me give you a précis of it that was kind of feeding off of or playing off of an article in the New York Times written by a woman who was really taking Bluey to task because they didn't like the picture of a husband. Let me see if I can get into that and again give you a précis of that particular work. Again, it touches on Bluey, which has become, again, as I said, in many ways, a discussion point on dads today. I mean, you survey the literature. I mean, you survey what's being said about fatherhood. I mean, you just can't hardly read an article without reading something about Bluey. This has just become something of a thing. There was, I mentioned this New York Times article. There was a pop culture critic named Amanda Hess who argued that the immensely popular Australian children's character, Bluey, cartoon, is problematic. And according to her, the cartoon offers an over idealistic portrayal of parenting, especially of fathers. And not only is Bluey's puppy dad Bandit a good father, she'll grant, he's a fantasy. one crafted to appeal to adults as much as to children. Bandit seems omnipresent in these 7-minute episodes, and he's too often playing with his daughters and doing homework, as opposed to doing homework. He represents a parent freed of drudgery, whose central responsibility is just delighting his kids. And the reason why a positive portrayal of dads is a bad thing is often seen as something called the soft bigotry of low expectations. She's not really arguing that cartoon dads shouldn't be good dads, but as if they're too good, then real life dads might feel guilty, and real life kids with absent or abusive dads might feel worse. In other words, if everyone does not meet a high bar, we should lower it. In a strange sense, of course, she's actually making a case that dads really do matter. Craving a dad who is constantly present, attentive, and a loving, parent reflects something about who we are and what we need, whether we received it or not. We have that craving because it is built into the fabric of reality. We may wish and often, repeat that men and women are interchangeable, and therefore moms and dads are too, but our hearts say otherwise. In fact, social science routinely confirms how important fathers are for the health and well-being of children. Kids who grow up without a dad at home are 3 times more likely to engage in criminal activity. They are more likely to engage in sexual activity earlier. They are less likely to go to college. They are more likely to have emotional and behavioral problems, more likely to struggle academically. They're twice as likely to commit suicide. It has been shown in a lot of sociological works that a child, the best predictor that a child will hold on to their Christian faith into adulthood is if their dad held on to his faith and nurtured a close bond with his kids. And work of sociologist Christian Smith, which we've also dealt with in previous podcasts, supported this as well. None of this means, of course, that children who grow up with an absent or abusive dad are doomed to failure, or that children who grow up with faithful, attentive dads are guaranteed success. But if we do know instinctively and empirically how important dads are, and shouldn't we hope for good fathers to be modeled in the media and elsewhere rather than fewer? And this again, I'm giving you a précis of this Breakpoint article. This was the point that it was making. There was an episode of Bluey called Hospital. Bluey and her sister decided to perform surgery on their dad. And as is characteristic of the show, a few jokes are clearly aimed at the parents watching. And at one point, Bluey Bandit asks kind of pleadingly if there is another game they could play in which he could just lie on the couch and do nothing. This example isn't one of perfect fathering that some might complain about, but it's realistic and reveals the real problem with this particular cartoon dad. And I put problem in parentheses. He doesn't treat his children like objects or status symbols or constant irritants or as items on a bucket list or as obstacles to freedom or to prosperity and autonomy. As has been put by others, we tend to think of kids as serving adult desires rather than an ends in and of themselves, whose needs and well-being should be put first. According to the New York Times and others, the problem with Bluey is that it never portrays the drudgery of parenthood, peddling instead some kind of irrational idea that a parent should delight his kids. In that critique, it's not possible for a dad to feel annoyed, bored, and pulled in too many directions, but still choose to play goofy games like Hospital, because he knows at some level just how consequential his love, time, and attention is for his kids. In fact, it's more than possible that the ratio of annoyance to lifelong importance is outrageously lopsided. It's not only possible, it's essential, because only a dad can be a dad.
Now, wait, if you go to the Bible to get a vision for fatherhood, you're often going to come away disappointed. Okay, so if Bluey, if Bluey is a modern example of wow, fathers can be fun and attentive, that's great. But let's think about what, a biblical father might be like.
Yeah, that's not always the greatest place to find a role model. I mean, some of the greatest biblical heroes were terrible dads. I mean, Isaac and Jacob played favorites with their kids. Eli and Samuel did little to curtail their son's wickedness. David's kids wanted to usurp his throne. I mean, on it goes. And yet, these men are often referred to as heroes of the faith as if their abdication of the fatherhood role deserves, I don't know, minor consideration. Where can we find a model of a godly father in the Bible?
Well, first, real quick, a quick parenthetical remark on, and you know this, which is that when the Bible does portray these men of faith, their fatherhood is critiqued.
Yeah.
David, I mean, was critiqued for much about being a father, much about being a husband, and much about a lot of things, and obviously so was Jacob and others. So, I mean, I think that we need to say that that was not the part of their faith that was being elevated.
Mhm.
But let me answer what you've said in two ways. First, you're absolutely right. There's only one good father in the Bible, and it's God the Father.
Mhm.
Most of the earthly representatives, even in his pages, are deeply flawed. But having said that, I think what you can find in the Bible are the marks of good fathering. You know, you may have in the narrative sections a lot of bad fathering, but in those narratives, you still find okay, well, here are the good marks. Almost like, now let's look at the opposite of what you would do. Don't be like this, be like this. And also didactic teaching about the positive marks of fathering. And let me just give you one as an example that's found in both narrative and didactic sections of the Bible. So it's really kind of a universal principle related to fathering effectively, parenting effectively, but I'll speak it on fathering particularly. And that's the idea, of blessing. Blessing. It's just a powerful idea to chase and to study and to learn about in terms of this. In biblical times, a father's blessing was a very special and even formal event. And their book on this, Gary Smalley and John Trent, write that a blessing was when a father would lay hands on them, speak a verbal message, express encouragement, love, and acceptance, talk positively about that child's future, pledge themselves to making that future happen. It was almost transactional, something that you were bequeathed. And you find that kind of substantive idea of blessing in the blessing Jacob gave his sons, Esau and Jacob, on his deathbed. Esau, as the oldest, was to be blessed accordingly with all the rights and privileges thereof, with being the first. The day for Esau's blessing came. He hunted for the right game, cooked it to his father's taste, all to gain his father's approval and favor. And then he brings the meal to his father, only to find that his father had been deceived into giving his blessing to his younger brother, Jacob. His father's sight was poor, virtually blind. Jacob tricked the old man into blessing him instead, which was highly significant because in biblical times, once a blessing was given, it was done. It was irretrievable. You couldn't take it back. The pain of that story is just palpable when you read it as a father-son narrative, particularly when Esau just begs him, "Oh, Father, bless me too. Please say that you have something for me, some blessing for me, something to say about my future and my identity." And then he broke down and wept, Scripture says. And if you know anything about the character of Esau in the Bible, that may have been the first time the man ever wept. And that's the cry of every boy's heart. Because while the Bible's concept of a formal blessing was unique to those times, perhaps, the idea of a relational blessing is still alive and well and important. We can and should build blessing into our children's lives. Children need to hear words of love and acceptance from their parents, and I would argue particularly their father. I once read a bit about the background of a wide receiver of the wide receiver Demaryius Thomas, Christian man, who died at the age of 33, tragically, of a seizure following an accident after a wildly successful career in the NFL. He wrote how his mother was arrested and sent to prison when he was only 11. His father was in the military. His stepfather and grandmother were also imprisoned. At age 11, he was basically an orphan. So how did he make it through? Well, let me read you his words here. I brought them with me. He said, "I had multiple high school coaches who looked out for me, multiple college coaches, deacons, pastors, aunties, uncles, friends. I talked to a lot of kids who have parents in prison or who left them when they were young. They just want somebody to say, 'I care about you.' But that doesn't happen enough, so they get into trouble. As men, as athletes especially, we don't like to talk about love. We talk about brotherhood and all that, but not love. but it's the most important thing in a child's life. More important than the kind of school you go to or what neighborhood you live in, or even if you grow up around drugs and violence. If you are loved, you'll make it out. But those aren't the only words that sons in particular need to hear. Just think back to what God the Father said to Jesus the Son, the blessing that was there. And he did it not once, but twice, at his baptism and at his what is called the Transfiguration, when he was revealed to his most intimate followers in his full glory. Both times, God the Father erupted from heaven with a single statement: "This is my Son, who I love, who I am well pleased. Listen to him." Those are three blessings. The Son belonged to the Father. This is my Son. The Son was valued. I am pleased with him. And the Son is competent. Listen to him. But there's more that a son needs to hear. Boys, and from their fathers, boys look to their fathers for what it means to be a man and to feel like they are one. John Eldridge, in his book Wild at Heart, and I don't give that a wholesale endorsement. There's parts of it I like. There's parts of it I don't. There's parts of it I think that have issues, but I think on some things it's spot on. And I do think when he points out how men, he talks about how men complement each other differently, how they speak to a different part of a boy's ego, how men rarely praise each other directly like women tend to. Like a woman might say to another woman, "Oh, I love what you did with your hair," or "Where did you get that blouse?" Guys don't talk that way. We tend to compliment by way of accomplishment. And the only person who can affirm that in a growing, developing boy, in a way that they'll hear, is often another man, and no one more so than his father. And it's not just a blessing on their masculinity, guiding and shaping them into becoming a man. It's a blessing on their person, on their life. It's speaking into and onto their life in a way that shapes how they view themselves. I've always been taken by what the Apostle Paul said to a group of people on this subject in his first letter to the Thessalonians, and I've referred to this, and I've in my own life for a long time, but also in working with people. Paul wrote to them, and he said, "With each of you, we were like a father with his child." He said, "We held your hand, we whispered encouragement, and we showed you step by step how to live well before God." You want Fatherhood 101? I mean, who wouldn't want a father like that? Understanding, encouraging, merciful, compassionate, loving, tender, patient. But that's a blessing that only a parent can give. And it's not just our sons that need a father's blessing. It's our daughters. It's also been noted that the heart cry of a woman's heart when it comes to a man is, am I lovely? Will you pursue me? Do you delight in me? Will you fight for me? Nothing is more devastating for her to hear, "No, you're not beautiful. No one would ever fight for you." Which is why God made men to storm the tower of a woman's heart and offer his strength to her, I think, when it's at its best. To do all in their power to not only protect and to provide, but to nurture and to heal. To say, "Yes, you're lovely. And yes, there is one who would fight for you. I would die for you." With a daughter, this comes out in making sure she always feels protected and that she always feels cherished. We're all aware of the increasing complexities and sexualization of young girls throughout the world, from ads and video games to clothing and cosmetics. It's been well documented that leads to demeaning and damaging results. As they are led to obsess more and more about their body image, young girls become more prone to eating disorders and low self-esteem and depression and promiscuity. Columnist Kathleen Parker did an article on this once. And when she got done, she raised a question that I think surprised a lot of people who were reading her as she was going along. When she got done with all the things that were happening with young women today, she simply ended by saying, "Where are their fathers? Where are their fathers?" And it was the right question. And I remember at the same time reading, I'm going on here, but I'll try to wrap it up. But I remember reading at the time about an article that was very disturbing to me about Lindsay Lohan. She started out as a child model, went into acting, and early on had incredible success with The Parent Trap and Freaky Friday and Mean Girls. But then the reality of what was going on with her life erupted into full public view, and it was well documented: DUIs and probation and repeated trips to rehab and more legal problems related to misdemeanors and violations of probation. And her career quickly, disappeared almost as quickly as it came into view. And then I stumbled across this interview where Michael Lohan was asked about how he felt, that was her father, about his daughter's then recent photo spread in Playboy. And he responded he was very happy with the pictures, even calling it a good choice. After all, he said he had heard the spread was classy. I don't know, Lindsay Lohan, only the sad state of what was at least then her unraveling life. It seems to have righted itself of late, and which I'm really grateful. She seems like a delightful young woman. But I do know that there should be a special allotment of grace extended toward anybody whose father would approve of his daughter embracing pornography. There's a special relationship between a father and a daughter, one set in place by God as part of the very structure of the family. From a father, a daughter learns what to look for in a man. She's got an expectation of how she should be treated. From a father, a daughter gains security in her self-esteem and a sense of her self-worth as a woman. From a father, a daughter is offered protection and never has to worry, or shouldn't ever have to worry, about being vulnerable. From a father, a daughter is given moral guidance and a protected virtue. From a father, the daughter receives affection in ways that fulfill a young, developing heart. In short, from a father, a daughter is provided for, she's protected, she's cherished. But I suppose I should say from a father who's being a father, meaning he's blessing her life the way we're talking about it. If young girls don't get their self-image grounded in a healthy way from their father early on, they will go out searching for it in ways that are not healthy and will cheapen their womanhood. As Parker writes, fathers are the ones who tell their little girls that they're perfect just the way they are, or at least they should, which is why fathers need to be affectionate toward their daughters and compliment them and let them know that they're truly the princesses that they long to be. For fathers are the most significant men in their life until marriage. I remember when this was driven home to me as a father with my first daughter. I have two, and then I have several more daughters in the Lord. But when she was a very little girl, my oldest daughter, Rebecca's favorite story was Cinderella. She asked me to read her that story so many times, Alexis, that she could repeat it by heart before she ever learned to read. It was a little weird. Freak people out. Does your 1-year-old not, 2-year-old not read yet? But one night after reading that story to her again, and which ends with Cinderella dancing at the ball with the prince and then getting married, she asked me if I had married mommy. I told her I had, and that I loved her mother very, very much, and that I loved her very much too, and that she would always be my princess. Put her to bed, didn't think anything else about it. When I came home from work the next day, Rebecca was waiting for me at the top of the stairs of our house. And she had a blanket, I remember, draped over her shoulders and some cardboard stuff on her feet that she had obviously made and painted. I don't know what in the world was going on until Susan whispered to me from behind her back that she was pretending to be Cinderella. And then it all made sense. She was in her wedding dress with her glass slippers, waiting for her daddy, the prince, to come home and dance with her. And I put on some music and picked up my princess, and we danced. And later on, Susan told me that Rebecca said that when she grew up, she wanted to marry daddy, just like Cinderella married the prince. That's the role a father is going to play in a daughter's life. In fact, in the original Hebrew language, which is what the oldest part of the Bible was written in, the meaning of the word to bless literally meant you bent the knee. To bless was to bow the knee, as in giving honor and deference to someone as a prince would a princess. My sons still talk about how I would always say to them when getting in the car, okay, guys, wait, the girls get whatever seat they want first, then you can take what's left over. Sorry. Or I would say, hey, make sure you open the door for your mom make sure you open the door for your sisters. The point was that the women of the family were to be treated as royalty. We were blessing them as women. And to this day, I try to do that with my daughters. I remember one year, this meant the world to me, and then I'll shut up. One year after, and you may be done, but after sending my oldest daughter, Valentine's present, I give my daughters and all my granddaughters Valentine's presents. Rebecca, my Cinderella girl, wrote me a little text in return, and she said, "I got my Valentine's present," and she said, and this is all she said: "You always make me feel so special." And I just thought to myself, okay, mission accomplished.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that. If there are any dads listening to this, I just pray that something from this podcast, I mean, certainly would just remind you of how important your role is and how God designed that to be just so. And I also just would ask, if you're not a dad, just continue to lift dads up in prayer. I really do think this is a especially challenging time for a dad, with many dads right now who didn't grow up with great father figures. Culture doesn't have a lot of, if the best example of a modern father is a cartoon character, then dads need a lot of help. But being married to a husband, father who didn't have a dad in his life, and yet is so present and so involved and so dearly loves our children, I know that it's possible. So I just pray that the biblical vision is the one that rules the day in the end. We can continue to love Bluey. I love Bluey, but I pray that, what you shared today, Jim, of just how God fathers and how he designed fathers to play such an important role in their children's life would really be what people walk away with today. So thank you. Thank you guys for listening. We'll catch you next week.